Hey, this is Kim Boltzma again, and welcome back to our Introduction to DSLR Photography Premium course. Last time we continued a three-part lesson on all things light. We talked about ISO and the different modes of white balance. Today we're going to finish discussing light, but this time in terms of exposure compensation and exposure bracketing. Alright, let's start today by discussing exposure compensation. Exposure compensation is another way you can trick your camera into allowing more light to the sensor for a better exposed picture. Many cameras allow 1/3 increments of exposure change above or below the zero value. For example, many cameras show it as a sliding scale such as this one. Depending on your camera, exposure compensation can come in many different ranges. The typical one is a plus or minus 2 stops, but some cameras will go as high as a plus or minus 5 stops. I'm going to repeat what I said about the exposure and white balance in the first of our three-part lesson on all things light. If you're shooting something that is primarily black, the camera will overexpose because it's trying to make that black an 18% gray. When you're shooting in fresh snow, on the other hand, the camera will see that pure white as gray and try to underexpose the picture, making the white snow a dull gray. Let's start with taking a picture of something black, like my computer bag. We start by setting our camera in program mode, using AWB as our white balance, choosing spot metering, and picking an ISO of 400. Notice how the camera is trying to expose the bag as if it were a dull gray. When we look in the viewfinder, there are some values at the bottom of the screen beneath the picture area. One of these is the exposure compensation. When you partially depress the shutter, you'll see that the camera is trying to overexpose the black. But we want to be true black, so we're going to underexpose it. Most exposure compensation buttons are indicated with an AV plus minus, but you'll need to check your camera's user manual if you don't quickly spot it. Using our exposure compensation, we're going to start by underexposing the shot by a -1. Our result is this. Notice that we still aren't quite right. We make an adjustment, take a shot, make an adjustment, take a shot, and we repeat until we get the computer bag a true black. We repeat the same process with a white object, making the background behind Mallory white. Using the exact same settings as before, program, AWB, spot metering, ISO 400, we snap a picture and see that the background is a dull gray. Since we want the paper to be white, we're going to this time overexpose it by +1. A few more adjustments and we finally get a true white background. Here's our result. The other exposure method we're going to discuss is exposure bracketing. Auto exposure bracketing, or AEB, is something you can use when you are unsure of how to photograph a specific scene. The camera will set itself up for 3 different exposures when you press the shutter 3 consecutive times. The first shutter is usually a standard exposure, where your exposure compensation is set at 0. The second shutter takes a decreased exposure. Let's use -1 for this example. The third shutter takes an increased exposure, say +1. You are now left with 3 different, often usable, shots of the very same scene with varying exposure compensation settings. If you have your camera set to take 1 picture at a time, you'll need to press the shutter 3 times. If your camera is set to continuous or high-speed shooting, you'll need to press and hold until all 3 shots have fired. If you don't hold the shutter down until the 3rd shot is taken, you'll need to finish pressing the shutter until all 3 shots have been fired. Another important thing to remember with auto exposure bracketing is that you must manually go back into your camera and set the AEB back to 0. Shut the camera off or fire the on-camera flash. Always remember that you have control over what the exposures are going to be in AEB. If you want it to only over and underexpose by 1/3 of a stop instead of a full stop, then you have to tell the camera to do just that. Let's move on to our assignment. I want you to hit the pavement and search for a difficult lighting situation, something where you're not sure on what you need to do. Set your camera like this. Program mode. Choose a white balance setting, or choose to go auto white balance. Choose an ISO. Here's where you have to start making decisions. A general rule of thumb: well-lit areas require a lower ISO, like 100 to 200. Very poorly lit situations require higher ISO values, like 800 and above. All others fall in the 200 to 800 range. Use a tripod. On the first few shots, I want you to play around with the exposure compensation. Does your subject need over or underexposing? Why? Then switch your camera to auto exposure bracketing and play around with the different values. Perhaps you'll choose a 0, a +1, and a +2. Perhaps you'll choose a -2/3 stop, a 0, and a +2/3 stop. Ultimately, you'll want to experiment with what is happening not only to the subject, but to the overall picture. This wraps up our final lesson in all things light. Next time, we're going to really dive into what's happening in program mode. Until then, I'm Kim Boltzma, and thanks for watching.